Hello, everyone. My name is Bhagwatkar. I'm a first-year biotechnology and Douglas student at the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences here at Rutgers. And today I will be your student moderator for the Gender, Climate, and Migration panel discussion. More than 1.2 billion people are experiencing severe climate and migration crises, and 80% of them are women. But more than just statistics, these facts represent lives uprooted by environmental displacement and deepened by gender inequality. Climate change does not affect everyone equally, and today we are here to explore why. To help us understand this topic a little better, we have three remarkable individuals here with us today. Dr. Susan Martin, joining us today through Zoom, is the founder of the Institute for the Study of International Migration and is also a Douglas alum, and has advised Congress and the White House on immigration policy. Her research focuses on climate-driven migration and particularly on climate-vulnerable populations. Ineza Umuhoza Grace, eco-feminist CEO and founder of the Green Protector, leads youth-driven climate advocacy in Kigali, Rwanda. Beyond being United Nations Environment Program's African Youth Ambassador and coordinator of the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, she amplifies global youth voices in climate policy. Dr. Manasa Bollempalli, postdoctoral researcher at our very own Human Ecology Department here at the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences School at Rutgers, and is also a member of the National Science Foundation's Coastlines and People Megalopolitan Coastal Transformation Hub, or simply known as the NSF COPE-MOC project, and focuses on developing decision frameworks for climate-driven migration and coastal hazards. She has also contributed to global climate policies within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, such as within the Group of 20 and Group of 7 summits, also known as G20 and G7. And moderating our discussion is Anu Gupta, Assistant Dean of Global Academic Programs at Rutgers, with extensive experience in international aid and student mobility programs. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, and on to Dean Gupta.
Thank you, Joy. I'm going to try to match your poise. You're a hard act to follow for sure. So welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Hopefully, I'm glad to see I'm not competing with food. And hopefully everybody's awake. And we're hoping for a very engaged conversation today. So I will invite, has Susan joined? Not yet? Okay, so I will invite first Ineza to introduce herself and say a few words about the quite formidable work that she's doing in Rwanda. And thank you for coming all the way here from Rwanda to join us today.
Thank you so much. I will start by saying murakoze, which is how we say it in back home. And then since this morning, my heart was bouncing, but I feel like we should start at least by clapping ourselves because we are women who are daring to try in this very hard, complex world we are living. And it's something that really speaks louder when you see women who are, going against all the odds. So I give an aspiration. So I came from a small country located in the East Africa called Rwanda, and I am an eco-feminist. I choose to define myself as such because I come from the ecosystem, because I believe that whatever harm we did to our planet, we are still able to restore it if we are daring to do whatever it takes. And then on the other side is the feminist, because I believe in the power of everyone to lead, especially women. And the reason is because this climate space sector we work on, you will not believe most of them are men, and most of them do not get a sense of having or willing to have women sit on the table. So me branding myself as a feminist is just to help them when they see me in the room to be like, oh, this is a woman who has an opinion, and the woman who's a woman who's not gonna bring me a coffee or take notes. She's just here. She wants to say something and have been helping me since I started my journey at the age of 20. And I'm part of the youth-led organization called the Green Protector, which started as in a bit of a group of young people trying to ensure that they're able to take action in supporting our community, and was started as like a club in school, and to be one of the only leading youth organization offering technical negotiation support to our country and paving the way for other youth groups, not only in our country, but also globally, which led to the starting of the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, which is also something that started on a Skype chat between 14 young people, but now is more than 1,000 young people from more than 100 countries, aiming to hold global leaders accountable to address the issue of climate change injustice. So that would be how I can go for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Ineza. And I just want to add, because Ineza is incredibly humble, she's won numerous international awards. She was a Global Citizen winner in 2023, an Obama leader in 2022, and in 2020, she was the National Geographic Young Explorer. And I know that I haven't covered the entire list. So again, we're truly honored, Ineza. So Manasa, you are a postdoctoral student with the Department of Ecology. So tell us a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Manasa. I'm a postdoc at the Department of Human Ecology. I also got my PhD at Rutgers, so I've been here for a while. I want to echo Ineza by saying how nice it is to be in a room with feminists and not having to sort of justify that word or defend it or think that you're saying something radical when it's just, equal rights and everything that comes with it, right? So I really appreciate having the chance to be here. I got my PhD in global affairs. My dissertation was on how sort of countries view climate change as a national security threat. And they also view immigration and refugees as national security threats, and how climate migration falls at the intersection of these two perceptions, and what kind of policies do these perceptions shape for climate refugees or people moving because of climate displacement. I know there's a lot of discussion about the consensus on the definition of climate refugees, et cetera, but that was my sort of thesis work. And now as a postdoc at Human Ecology, I'm part of the Coastal Communities Lab with Dr. Victoria Ramanzoni, whose students are here, who I've also taught. So it's really nice to see you guys. And we look at how households in the US Northeast are making decisions in terms of adapting to climate change, in terms of their mobility or in terms of their day-to-day sort of issues. So it's been a really nice journey because I've gone from this macro, high-level policy-making perspective or analysis to this very micro, on-the-ground level of climate displacement and climate mobilities. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about it, but that's a little bit of my journey, and I'm just happy to be here.
Thank you, Mansa. Has Susan Martin joined? Not yet? Okay, well, Susan Martin's going to join us in a little bit. I'll introduce myself. I'm Anu Gupta. I work for Rutgers Global. Very pleased that Rutgers Global has sponsored, is one of the sponsors of this program. I work with Rick Garfunkel, who I think was going to join us today. He's the Vice President for Global Affairs. My office provides international students with academic support, but also Rick and I work together to work with all our campus partners, some NGOs, in supporting refugee students and scholars on campus. So in my prior experience was over 22 years of international development in organizations like United Nations. I started my career in Vietnam with Food and Agriculture Organization, and then in Bangkok as an economic affairs officer with the Economic Commission for Asia and Pacific. Then I was in Ghana at the UN Institute for Natural Resources. And then my journey took me to the Emergency Response Division of United Nations Development Program, And there I worked for small arms and development projects in Albania, in Bulgaria in humanitarian aid, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Rwanda, Ineza. So I'm very happy to say that. I worked for an international NGO called Kickstart International, which provided irrigation solutions to small-scale farmers, farmers that typically did not get equipment from companies like John Deere. And most of our work was in Kenya and Tanzania. Also worked for Sesame Workshop, the company behind, the organization behind Sesame Street. And we harnessed the power of media there to really raise money for co-productions of Sesame Street in South Africa called Takalani Sesame, and in Egypt called Alam Sim Sim. And there we were, for example, in South Africa, we had a girl Muppet called Kami, that was orphaned by HIV/AIDS. So besides what we think about Sesame Street as ABCs, learning your ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, we were dealing with a lot of social issues, through the media. So that's a little bit about myself. Also, one thing, Rebecca, I thought about when you were talking about Katrina, my last job actually was with a financial institution called True Fund Financial Services that lends to low-income areas and areas to small businesses that are impacted by Katrina in Louisiana, Alabama. So I'm very honored to be here today and to moderate this very, very important conversation that's very dear to my heart. So while we are waiting for Susan, I'm going to kick it off with some questions for Ineza and for Manasa. So Ineza, you have described that you are an eco-feminist and spoken a little bit about that. What spurred you to become an eco-feminist? And what exactly, if you can explain a little bit more about that, is that a term that you define yourself as, or is that a term now that is embraced by other young people?
Okay. I'll start by saying that it's a term that I found myself with when as going, because I grew up in Rwanda and my family wanted me to go into science, which I was encouraged to, and I was not really that bad. So I didn't get all the A's, but it's not all the F in a way. And I ended up wanting to be a pilot. And then it was just after finishing my high school, I was watching the news on the television, and then I saw that a particular area in my country, women and children were forced to move from one place to another because of soil erosion and the flooding that was happening. And we have this brain, which is a very amazing tool, so you get to forget everything that is terrifying until you see something similar. So for me, seeing those images on the television kind of reminded me that I was waking up in the middle of the night by my mom because our house ceiling, the roof got destroyed. And me seeing that after a couple of years, the young women and the children are still living that pain and that sense of being powerless, I was like, let me try to do something. What can we do? And my mind at that time was all about, this is a natural hazard, natural disaster, because that's how on the news everything is framed. That was when I took the decision that I'm not going to study, piloting, all the cool stuff. And then I chose to study environmental engineering in my home country because I was like, I shouldn't move to study something to protect my community. And then through the studies, I found out that it was not natural disaster, it was climate change, and was something that my country didn't do much in terms of the causes, but we are at the front line. Because, for example, when on the news you hear like in Rwanda in 2020, we lost 4,000 hectares of land. For you, it can be a number, but for me, it's much more like we are having more women who are going to be pushed on the poverty line because agriculture is one of the sector of employment, and most of employers who practice that activity are small-scale farmers who are mainly women. For me, that is something that I didn't see sit well with me. So I was My first try was to talk with my sister, again, just to paint the fact that women and girls been like my inspiration since day one. So I went to my sisters and then I was speaking to them. And then they were telling me that they do not understand. And for me, that fact of seeing that I'm trying to do something that my sister are not understanding, that means it's still complicated, so I need to lay it down a bit. That is where as the idea came to start the organization called the Green Protector. At that time was called the Green Fighter. But then through the engagement, through talking with the local decision makers, they were kindly welcoming, like because we have these pillars of our economy and the policies where young people, like everyone is welcomed. But my biggest surprise was when I took my first plane and go to this big international conference. That was the very first time someone looked me in the eyes and was like, "You are a young person. You shouldn't be here." And I was like, "Wait, what?" I didn't understand what they were meaning. And then the second interaction was more like, "You are a woman. You shouldn't be here." Still trying to navigate that one, I went to the corner, and then someone was like, "You are a black woman. You shouldn't be here." Because just that's not a space. And I went back to my country delegation. I was like, how do you respond? Because it was my first time to be encountering this. And then they told me that I should wing it and then be strong, but then be strong in the sense of proving them wrong. And that is where I learned about the term feminist, and I think that was also the era where Beyonce's song was out, in a sense. And then I love Rihanna as well so much, and she's a troublemaker. So all of that, all that energy of other women who are daring to try and daring to, prove the system wrong is what I captured. And I was like, I'm gonna define myself as a feminist. But then having only a term feminist side was not enough for me, because I was still trying to ensure that that aspiration is going to be something that's gonna help people remember that we are on one planet, we have one planet, and women who, even though women are vulnerable, which is true. I have one of my friends who's almost every time he's like, you cannot change a story, but you can change a storyteller. So sometimes I feel like women, they should be the one telling their story. And then people will be surprised to see that women are not victims, because they are action takers, they are doing. But then because of a narrative that is always undermining them, they get to not to be seen. And I think the combination of those two, that what led me to be an eco-feminist. And now is something that is pretty much acceptable, because there's some corners I go in and people are like, "Oh, this is the Ineza, the eco-feminist," and I like it. Because at the end of the day, make them feel like I have an opinion. Sometimes it might be blah, 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 but it's okay. I'll still use my voice in a way.
Oh, Ineza, I know you changed the name of your organization to Protector, but I think you're a fighter, I think so. And I doubt very much that anybody was able to silence you or make you wait. So that's wonderful. I have another question for you. It's about the Loss and Damage Fund and your amazing work around that. So we know that that's called climate reparations as well. So I'm just wondering, I know you have a different opinion, so you can tell me what that is. You also started with the team Loss and Damage Coalition. I know that Dewey mentioned that in her introduction. So that fund is still not funded. So tell me a little bit more about what you think that work, the importance of that work continuing, and how you see it move forward.
Do you have 5 hours? So for me, like the term loss and damage to start means like the negative impact of climate change. And to my generation, at least on behalf of the members we have in the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, loss and damage is the intergenerational justice that we are facing, because we are on the era where it's no longer safe for the global south in a way, and even the global north, no one is safe in a way, but we still can do something. And when we started, it was much more of a call. We wanted global leaders to activate the finance, because when you look on the trajectory of the climate crisis, is like people had, like leaders had the time to adapt, but they didn't adapt in time because adaptation finance was not as accessible as people pretended to be, especially for global South community. And then we have loss and damage, which is the current reality. And when people call the loss and damage reparation, the reason why I was like, is because when you call it reparation, it's much more like, it's understandable, but it's a term that's not used in the climate change space. That's why we stick with the loss and damage finance, because reparation has another arm on it, but they can be in alignment. But loss and the reason why to keep it loss and damage is because that's the only defined terminology that we can use, and where we can hold leaders accountable. So there was a fight of having it established, which they did in a way, but we fall into a big trap, a trap that was mainly designed that countries are going to be having promises over promises, and then promises are not something that can be able to translate into action for developing country. That was the first trap. And the second trap was the fact that each time a country like mine is saying that we need to have access on loss and damage finance, people want to frame it as a charity, and it's not, because we've been paying loss and damage in terms of our GDP for a long time. Like in 2024, in just 3 nights, our country lost 3% of our GDP, just in 3 nights. When you have that kind of loss, you should be having like a system that is able to support you, but we do not have any. And now the time that we are into the designing, that's where people are now trying to shy away their responsibility and then give it to the private sector. And for me, my personal opinion is like, I do understand the need to come all together as one, but there need to be like a clear balance, separation line between how private sector is going to be engaged in this process, because we definitely do not want any organization or company to be making profit over people pain. And then I think lastly is much more also the realization that there's a need to have a stronger narrative, a narrative that is going to allow our everyone to be able to showcase their pain, because my suffering in Rwanda should not be the highlight, because there's also another suffering in Florida. We should all be able to come together as one, and that is what we are trying to do in the Youth Coalition, where we're trying to redefine what we actually mean by global solidarity for climate action. It's still like a long way to go, but I believe we are moving forward, or at least standing in the right way, but we're not going backward.
Thank you, Ineza. That's a great response. Susan Martin, I'm so glad you were able to join. It's so wonderful to see you. Susan and I've been privileged to work with Susan in the past. Susan, I have, since you've joined, could you tell us a little bit about your work and accomplishments?
I began to work on issues related to environmental change more broadly and climate change more specifically as a part of that in the 1990s. And my field is immigration and refugees, displaced persons. So I come into it from that perspective. And a number of us who are immigration experts, and particularly the International Organization for Migration, which is the UN agency now for immigration issues, we're very concerned that environmental groups were trying to get attention to the problems in the lack of understanding and a lack of action on environmental issues. And the way in which they were doing it, not all, but some of them were doing it, was to, in a way, scapegoat immigrants, that if you didn't take action to address climate change or other environmental changes, there'd be hordes of immigrants coming across the the world and going from developing to developed countries. And this was seen as a way of awakening the legislatures and other government officials. All it was doing was create a scare factor with regard to immigration. First of all, there was absolutely no evidence that there'd be mass movements, certainly not at that time, but the projections were that it was unlikely to be mass movements outside of the region and the countries that were experiencing the negative impacts of climate change. And what was completely lost was looking at how do you help people stay in place if that's what they want to do, adapt to climate change. And that's another part of the legal process now is we have loss and damage, as you heard about, but there was also an effort to develop more of a fund for adaptation. So adaptation for people who wanted to stay where they were, but were going to not be able to do it safely. And then safe and orderly processes by which people who have to move are able to get from where they're may be endangered because of climate change or other environmental factors, and get them to a safe place where they'd have a chance to really do something, continue to do something with their lives. And so a group of us got together, and I was asked to lead the process with the International Organization for Migration to bring together immigration experts and experts on climate change to talk about what the reality of the situation was, and to not do it as a way of scaring people, but as a way of really trying to get solutions for the people on the ground who were already, but would in the future be more adapt to the problems of adaptation. From there, after having written the first major report for the UN on migration and climate change, the whole issue sort of fell off the radar for a period of time. And I became the director of the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform, and I commissioned some research on this issue, particularly between Mexico and the U.S., and patterns of migration that might arise as a result of environmental factors. And it kind of got in and out of the consciousness of policymakers. And then around 2011, it resonated again for things that were happening in the world, recognition that the effects of climate change were deepening and likely to occur earlier than expected. But because some governments, particularly in the United Kingdom, was starting to do research on what the actual impacts were, and I was fortunate enough to be one of the advisors to that process in the UN, and that got me back into thinking about the issues on it. And pretty much what we had been saying for a couple of decades already were the evidence was starting to really demonstrate that, yes, it is an issue, yes, it is a problem, but it's going to be one primarily for the developing countries that are the ones who will need the most help. Neighboring countries, sometimes if it's not an internal displacement, and that we needed to be thinking ahead of what was needed in order to address it. That led eventually to a working group at the World Bank, which I chaired, that was in the context of we had both the World Bank's immigration area of work and their environmental area of work. So we were able to bring those two issues together. And the World Bank began a program of both research on trying to project what will happen in the future, looking in that research on what the impact of increased development would be in helping people to remain where they were or move more safely, and also what if we had the best outcomes on the climate side, what would be the impact on migration, and determined basically that if you did a combination of those two things, greater development aid and more action in reducing the impacts of climate change, you increased the numbers of people who would have to move very, very significantly. And the World Bank now has a program that's based on this research that is really trying to think about, particularly in Africa and some of the other hotspots for climate change, to figure out what are the best ways of dealing with these issues in a positive way rather than, a doomsday type of action. And so that's how I got into the field and some of the things that I've been able to do and things that I think are important accomplishments, because at least now the issue of migration and displacement is not only on the agenda, but it's in a much more constructive way than it had been previously.
Thank you, Susan, for your amazing work and commitment to this issue. I'm interested in the work on the gender aspect of some of the work that you're doing. So let's say about the World Bank Working Group on Migration and Environmental Change. How much was gender incorporated in discussion, policy, and programmatic initiatives?
Yeah, frankly, not enough. But yes, it was incorporated because that is a second issue that I've been working on for many years, has been the protection of refugees and internally displaced persons from both conflict and from environmental factors. So that's another kind of portfolio. And so through that, we were able to do some research looking at what were the sources of resilience and vulnerability, so that we were not just looking at what the problems were, but also trying to understand what it would be like if women had greater ability to use their resilience to help their families adapt to climate change, or again, to move safely. One of the things we found was that women tended to be left behind. The tendency was still very much for families to get enough money to get their sons out and earning money and sending remittances back. And in many countries, not all, some countries it's the exact opposite, the young women who were not having the access to education opportunities or to work opportunities that might help their entire family to do better. So we were able to raise some issues regard to that. It was very clear that in areas that are still highly dependent on subsistence agriculture, and that meant being dependent on women to do the agricultural work, because that's the way it happened in many of these countries, and we're also subject to climate change's adverse impacts. There weren't very many programs that were intersectional enough to bring all of that together. And to think about how do you deal with education, with employment, with healthcare, with children, what happens to children, and do it in a cohesive manner that would be able to deal with the issue, not just as climate change, but as the way in which climate change, gender, economics, and other factors work together. And I think that has been informing the World Bank and other organizations. The IOM, the International Organization for Migration, has also been looking at the issues in this kind of a format.
Thank you, Susan. You know, we've been talking a little bit about adaptation. So, Manasa, I wanted to turn to you. As I said, you're a postdoctoral student in the Department of Human Ecology that specializes in climate mobility. So before we talk about adaptation, can you speak a little bit about climate mobilities?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, as Dr. Martin already mentioned, there's this sense of using this idea of climate migration to create sort of this scaremongering where you're seeing, you know, where refugees have already, there used to be a sympathetic lens towards them. Now it's more of a scaremongering lens, these people coming over, taking over our culture, our jobs, etc., right? And something similar happens along the lines of environmental migration to this idea of climate refugees, despite being like vastly unsubstantiated, you know, the numbers not being actually accurate. So climate mobilities is this, again, emerging idea, or maybe it's something that's already been there and we're just learning to look at it that way, where you sort of, you want to de-exceptionalize this idea of migration. You want to recognize that people are constantly moving. Humans are a migratory species in that sense, and there's nothing exceptional about wanting to move because the environment in your current home is bad, be it like climate or domestic environment or whatever, right? But then mobility can take a lot of forms. It can be long distance, short distance, it can be going to a shelter during a cyclone, it can be, or it can also be immobility, like people who want to stay back and like, you know, not actually leave their homes. We see this in the news a lot about the Pacific Islands sinking or the small islands sinking, but now it's coming into the news a lot more, but the people on these islands don't actually, might not want to leave their home, their sovereignty, their roots, right? So we need to find ways to recognize these type of mobilities too, short-term, long-term mobilities for financial adaptation, like Dr. Martin mentioned, and also the role and conditions for those who are disabled or elderly or immobile in any other sort of way that we typically think of mobility. So climate change is not just an exceptional event. It's not a storm that happens once or twice a year. It's also increasing frequency of rains. It's also a heat wave in the summer. So part of our work in Philadelphia, for example, looks at how close people are to cooling shelters. Are people accessing cooling shelters? How would people consider relocating because of the extreme heat waves in Philadelphia or the coastal inundation in New Jersey? So mobility can encompass a wide variety of, you know, movement.
So your work on, you know, with NSF Coastlines and People Program, as well as a lot of your ethnographic research, you look at climate impacts. So can you give us some examples of social resilience and cultural adaptation?
Yeah, I think one of the, so we started out in this project, we are mostly working in the US Northeast, right? I can give you, I think, an example from the US and one from India where I did ethnographic work. But in the US, we went into Philadelphia thinking, because Philadelphia has very high flood risk, we went in there during the field work thinking that, you know, people would talk about flooding, people would have had their basements flooded. But what we found out was entirely something else altogether, that people were more concerned about the lack of green spaces, extreme heat in the summer, for example, or food insecurity. So you go in thinking, you know, the science is telling you that this is a climate factor that is happening, and it might be happening, but for people, there might be other factors that are more immediate at that given point in time, right? So yeah, okay, your basement flooded, but that happened maybe once every 3 months. But you're facing like multiple days of severe heat in the summer, so that tends to stick to you. You don't have access to like a grocery store. you may be unhoused, you don't want to go to cooling shelters because these are known to be sort of violent spaces and not necessarily safe spaces. So when we started looking at flood adaptation, we had to take into consideration all of these sort of other factors and then readjust our research strategy a little bit to figure out that climate adaptation has to be a holistic sort of multidimensional thing. It cannot be just one climate impact. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a great answer. So what are some of the exacerbating pre-existing gender inequalities and also some vulnerabilities?
Right.
And
I think, well, we do not live in a gender equal world as of yet. So whatever sort of inequalities exist get filtered through climate impacts as well, right? And so when I first started out doing this climate work, I was doing ethnographic research in like a fishing market in South India. And there the division of labor is very clear. The men go out to fish, the women like handle the market. They buy the produce from the fishermen and then they sell it to customers. And then I was there in the aftermath of a cyclone. So the concerns from like the men were very different in the sense that because of extreme weather events, they're having to go further and further out to get a good catch. And this is something we also see, I think, happening in the US fishing industry. But for the women, the concerns were entirely different. They lost all of the infrastructure of the market to sell their produce. Especially in South India, they tend to be household financial managers. So they lost sort of the surplus income to, pay for your school fees or buy groceries or whatever, right? And then they were the ones who were often being targeted by these microfinance lending schemes or a lot of these informal sort of banking and financial mechanisms. So I think these are some of the ways in which women get impacted. Their mobility sort of tends to get restricted because of pre-existing social constructs. And that becomes more severe in the aftermath of a disaster because someone has to stay home and take care of the kids, right? Mm-hmm. And then, so they get more and more sucked into the work of the reproductive economy when a climate event happens, rather than being supported to participate in the productive economy. Does that, yeah.
Yes, that's great. I had never heard the term reproductive economy until I spoke to you the last time, so it's very enlightening. So I do want to, ask Ineza and Susan as well to talk about some of these exacerbating pre-existing gender inequalities and what you've seen and what is some of the policy, legal, economic decision-making work that's going on to counter some of these vulnerabilities?
Where to start?
I told you I would ask hard questions.
Yes, but I think from my perspective, there was a little bit of movement of increasing at least women participation in the decision-making process, and I think part of that drive is what make me do the work that I do in a way. But even that one is still not as equal as we tend to look at it, because I think last COP there was an assessment that no matter how many women were on the table, men tend to speak more than women, and that is also something that regenerated a new issue that sometimes we are fighting for women to have a seat at the table, but no, they are not willing to speak up, because once a woman is on the table, there's going to be navigating a lot of other social barriers that are happening, and no one is looking at those because each woman is different. Each culture also is unique. And then in terms of dealing with the when climate change impact happen, I would say that women tend to, we live in not an equal world, but then when you add climate, the gender inequality lens tend to go bigger and much more further. So even if there was some good examples or some forward work on trying to increase the accessibility of education of young women in the rural area, when that particular area is going to be having flooding or drought, and then the women are going to be and young girls are going to be the one who drop out, because they're going to be the one who have the church to go to fetch water on a longer distance. They're going to miss school, and then they're going to be having additional careers. And then when we also talk about how many people are dying when we have flooding or cyclone, most of them are women, because women tend to try to go back in the house, bring that book, bring that picture, and then the house collapses or everything collapses. And when you look on how readiness programs are designed, most of the time they're designed to fit for men, not for women. And that is also another issue, because sometimes we do not understand that women need also to be ready to fight back, ready to swim, ready to navigate that boat, ready to know how to put on like a safety net. And when we also talk about how people are trying to have this microfinance institution or business opportunity, sometimes they do not consider women voices at the center, because a lot of these land where we want to have agriculture, like smart green agriculture, are not owned by women. There's a need to also understand that sometimes, even if you do want to have that accessibility, you need to go to the deeper cause of what is causing women to not be where you want them to be. Also, I think, lastly, is also this sense that sometimes I feel like even the world is not really ready to know who's doing it in a good way, so that we can learn from them, and we tend to keep the message that everything is bad. So it's we are not even creating that aspiration of women heroes or women warriors who are trying, so that at least their stories are properly captured, and then they can be able to transfer to a wider audience of young girls, because we do not have so many heroes as women in a way.
Absolutely. That's a great point, Ineza. And that goes back to the point that women are not just victims, right? So this, I know that we only have a few minutes before we go into Q&A. This is for anyone on the panel. So how do we empower women to become leaders and agents of change in their communities, as well as leverage their knowledge and expertise to inform climate policies and migration responses?
I think the way we help, one is to increase the access to education at all levels. That if women don't have access to education and don't have access to a source of income that is not related to a husband or a father or a son, then I think that the chances of them being able to participate. I mean, migration is very, very expensive, and women tend to have less resources. I think you have to make some distinctions between migration and displacement. Displacement often, happens with no planning. People are not expecting it, and they're, fleeing horrible circumstances. Migration can be an anticipatory process in which you aren't waiting for the worst to happen, but you're trying to figure out a way that you can come out ahead. But what we're finding, and I used to often talk about migration as an adaptation strategy. I don't do that as much anymore, because some of the recent research is showing that if you don't already have human and financial resources at your disposal, migration actually makes life worse rather than better. And so you have to really think about what it is. But if you're, so at the core is that the same reason we want to educate women for lots of reasons, for being active in this realm is really, really important. A second thing is that we do need to do a better job of educating policymakers on what all of this means. and why it is that they need to have women at the table. And during the Biden administration, on a related but a little bit separate issue, there were some real advocacy done by various different groups that refugees had to be at the table at every meeting, international meeting or domestic meeting, that was going to make decisions that affected their lives. And there was a big push that women had to be part of that. And we eventually got to the point where the Biden administration always had a refugee on the delegation for any refugee-related meeting within the United Nations. And very often it was a woman who was speaking. And that gives, when governments can stand up and show other governments that it's important to have women and people with lived experience of the issue that's being addressed, I think it really does help a great deal. Of course, we're not going to see that in the next 4 years, but hopefully, the concept won't be lost, even if it's hard to implement during certain periods. So I'll leave it at that.
Yes, thank you, Susan. I had promised Rebecca to not cause all of us to fall into despair, so I won't continue the conversation around the next 4 years. So Ineza, do you or Manasa, would you like to join in and add something to this?
I think for me, shortly, would be the way to empower women first is to recognize them and then be grateful to understand that you don't need to add externally, you need to help them add internally. So that will require a lot of unlearning of everything that you learn in school or in your research paper or any scientific discovery you have, because women are like the carrier of a long-term knowledge of how the community in a particular area have been living. And as my colleague said, sometimes you want them to move and they do not want. And I think that is a key point, because sometimes you need to understand that women can help you design a fit-for-purpose solution for them, but for that you just have to, go as a visitor and then sit and then talk with them in a way.
Thank you, Ineza. Manasa?
I agree with what Ineza and Dr. Martin have said. I also think that an important element of empowering women is also to sensitize the other gender and to focus on their education as well, because the roadblocks often come from those in power who do not perhaps subscribe to a feminist worldview. So I think it's important to, because I think that's also becoming an issue of this endemic male violence and men feeling male loneliness, or men feeling this, this fear that they've been marginalized. So I think it's important that the education also be a part of their sort of journey.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, thank you to all three of you. And now Julia and I will facilitate some Q&A. Hopefully we are going to have a really engaged conversation with all our eco-feminists here.
Yay.
Thank you all. I just have a quick question, which is maybe less related to migration, but more so like climate change adaptation and the transition to renewables. Because as you all know, like in the more developed world, we're like at a point now where we are moving to renewables, whether or not it feels like it right now in America, that is the case. And it's expensive, it's getting cheaper, but I know that a big problem is that at this point, a lot of low-income countries are now starting to have more energy independence and growing their economies based on what is usually now natural gas, because that's what they have access to now. And so I'm just curious, like, if that's anything any of you have seen the role that women play in those technologies, and how you see that playing out in the future, because in order for these economies to grow or to increase access to education and healthcare in these places, you need energy. You need to eventually switch to renewables, but it's definitely going to be hard. And like, what role does the developed world that's already has these technologies, like what are the dynamics there?
I can jump on that. My answer is gonna come. Take it the way it comes, because first of all, when people say renewable is going to be the answer, my head goes like, because renewable access to the global south or developing countries is not the same, because they are trying to use post-colonial metrics to keep like buying from us but not paying us in a sense. When we hear that a lot of countries are going to transition for renewable, like electric cars and everything, those are the critical minerals, and the critical minerals are mainly from developing country, and guess what? We are not owning any of them, because whenever our country is trying to fight back to own our land, our natural resources, they're gonna be creating propaganda to help to like let the world know that we are doing it in the wrong way. And when we go to these international conferences, most of the time they are pushing us in a way that we have to, go green. And no one is against going green, but we just want to be able to take part of a decision and the transition in an equitable manner, but they're not allowing it in a sense. I feel like in the next, like everything that currently in developing country that is being taken, it's not even an energy access to Africans, for example. 98% of it is shifted to America and Europe, because it doesn't make sense that our continent is the one that can be energy sufficient, and yet we have more than 74% of our population living without electricity. And when we are calling that we need infrastructure for renewable, like no one is willing to give it, because it's much more like if our countries are owning the land and the critical minerals to develop, then we are going to be like the next developed country or continent. To be honest, this is a fight of who want to stay on the power. It's not the fight who want to work together for all of us to be on a safer planet. But because now developing countries learn how to speak, how to act, and how to understand, that's why we have this fight. That's why also you see a lot of pressure between don't quote me. If you quote me, I'm not gonna repeat it. Like you see the fight between the Americans and the China, because it's not against anything. It's just economic power. And then China is one of the country who is named as developing country, and actually China is doing a lot in the South-to-South cooperation with other country. But when you look on the Western side, they are trying to keep the post-colonial, colonial kind of metrics, and that's the one we don't want to, entertain. And then at the end of the day, I feel like, yes, renewable are nice, but it doesn't matter on are they equitable, and is every voice on the table, because currently we are not. And also, like when we talk about the carbon credit, no one wants to put a common price of carbon. They want to put it on $5 in a sense, and that is because we can buy carbon credit, but for the development of our countries, but they want to use it on a very low price. When we try to increase the price, no one wants to. And then the carbon pricing is the one that has a source for adaptation, which means like it's a way to give money for developing country, not to go like in a black energy, if I can say, but more to be resilient. And the resilience go as well in how they're able to own their land and their resources. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ineza.
Hi, thank you guys so much for speaking and giving such tremendous insight and perspective. I do have a question, and this may be outside of your research, but I can't help but think about the opposite of migration in terms of deportation and the deportation efforts that are currently being administered by this administration. I know that like large-scale mass deportation has a tremendous impact on the economy, and it's a negative impact on the economy. So in terms of, spewing rhetoric like this by the current administration, what is the impact of large-scale deportation on climate change efforts? Like, what does that look like? And I'm not sure if you guys know the answer to it, but I was just curious.
The last part of it surprised me because it was the impact on climate change rather than climate change's impact on the people who are being deported. So it depends on how you kind of frame the question on it. Large-scale deportation, I think it's not going to have a particularly large impact on climate change, if you frame it in that way. And largely because most people totally overestimate the number of, or the proportion of the population who are international migrants today. It's grown somewhat, but it's only about 3.5% of the population of the entire world. There's some countries where it's higher, some countries where it's much lower. But you're not going to have a huge impact on what might be a very small proportion of that 3.5% proportion who are deported. So I don't think that that is really something that is going to have large scale impact on climate change. What I think, though, is that climate change will have impact, and particularly, as I mentioned before, on internal movements of people within their countries. And in that case, what we're talking about is whether or not people are able to, number one, move in a safe, orderly, and regular way within their own country, and be recognized as still citizens and people who have the right to whatever rights citizens have. And we do have an awful lot of situations where internally displaced persons are treated as if they're the international community's responsibility, but we don't want the international system to come in and tell us what to do, and and the people get caught in the middle, which is a bad outcome no matter what you want to think about. And so I think that that's really where we should be putting a lot more of our efforts on, to make sure that the internal displacement, which is, and this is both wealthy countries and poor countries, the level of internal migration and movements is going to be increased. And so I think what we need to do is to make sure that people are able to move when they can in a way that doesn't subject them to deportation, that provides them a legal status that allows them to work and to remain within another country or return home if conditions allow them to happen. So I think that, given where the movements are going to be, we really have to frame the issues quite differently than how we're doing so today.
Thank you very much for your experiences and insight. My question is about, with your experience seeing gender migration, what does it do to the impact on cultural heritage? What is lost? Whether they are through death, as you said, that they're not surviving, or that they are moved to these different areas or different countries?
That's a very interesting question. I don't necessarily know that I've thought about a loss of culture in terms of migration. I mean, yes, there is some, I think, but I also think culture is sort of an evolving matter. Like culture evolves when people move across borders or through generations. And women tend to be sort of, the caretakers of kinship networks. They do, but in a way that's both a burden and a sort of, that they are sort of the carriers of this culture. So it's both an honor, but also a burden. So I don't necessarily know that culture gets lost if you migrate somewhere as a woman. It might change into something else because that's part of adaptation as well. Whether that something else is good or bad is up for debate, I guess, right? Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question, but that was very interesting.
I just wanted to see your perspective, because as an immigrant,
I know.
my culture is different from another Asian woman.
Yeah. But it's unique to each individual's journey as well as a community's journey on a larger scale. So I think culture takes on many interesting forms when you migrate, either to adapt to a local setup or to build resilience to, and it becomes a support system, but it can also become, I think, a way to oppress in some ways. So, yeah.
The birth of my question is really from your comment, whether or not they are not being moved or they die, the culture also die with them.
I think what I was going to add is it depends. But most of the time, the women lose their cultural heritage when they lose their land, because there's some know how to do like some plants they were having, or like the what people call indigenous. I don't like that term. Like some their local food they were using, but now they're not able to carry that, because when you migrate, you cannot take your fruits, your fruit tree, and then a lot of the losses that they have goes around the dish in like the food they make, and then when they are choosing to stay, I think it's much more they want to stay as long as it takes to see that they're able to be resilient enough. It's like migration is like on the last list. They just want to, can I just go maybe 5 meters after 10 meters, but not out of my land, because they feel attached, especially also like the ancestral knowledge that they are carrying, and also the linkage they have with their land also tend to be one of the things that they don't want to lose. But it becomes harder when you have a prediction that the area is going to be submerged, because a lot of islands in the Fiji, like in the ocean or in the Caribbean, are being submerged, and that is where things get problematic, and the migration is the only thing for their survival, and they hate it.
Hello. First off, thank you so much for the insights you guys have brought today. My question is about going back to what Manasa, you said about in gender dynamics, how men tend to talk more even when women are at the table. So building off of desired outcomes like that, I was wondering what are some desired outcomes that you guys see for more gender equality or more women-led discussions, while also taking into account how men can conduct themselves. So I was wondering about the outcomes and also the intervention strategies, types of conversations that might come from, that might help get to those outcomes.
Thank you for the question. I think Ineza mentioned that men tend to talk more even in a room full of women. And I think, you have to, it's about, I guess, an easy to understand example. Of course, we do like the large scale things, right? Bringing women to the power table, to where decisions are making at like maybe a representation level at the national, international, global scales. But I think it also tends to start very small. And one of my favorite sort of illustrations is how household labor is divided in a home, right? It's all, see, it's everyone knows this intimately. it's about, I think, the more you teach sort of both genders maybe to perform more household chores, domestic chores, I think that really makes a huge difference in how you relate to the other gender, because that's how women get trained to do the care work. That's how women get trained to think about what's for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, what should I feed the kids, what should I feed the husband. But men, I have at least seen very few men actively take ownership and responsibility of that aspect of work. And I think it's like a small thing which is indicative of a larger participation model in our policy-making system, right? So I really think household labor or household division of labor makes a huge, huge difference in educating or in equalizing the gender dynamics.
Yeah, and if I can add, it just if you're a man, in a way, just recognize that you, that virus, if I will say, that we all have, and then trying to notice it and then act on it. Because it won't change in one night, because we are from a very long system of history that is embedded, and we kind of think that everything is okay, we only do. And when you see, for example, you are at work and then you bring your child as a man, and then people are like, oh, congratulations, and just be like, no, I'm just doing my responsibility as a father, trying to notice and then, have that equalizers in a sense, because I feel like even the men who are trying to be as feminist as they can, sometimes they tend to take it in the wrong way, and then we get toxic feminist, and we don't want anything toxic.
Thank you, Ineza.
Could I add one thing to this conversation? And that's for anyone who wants to be at the table in international organizations or in Congresses nationally, or whether it really takes some training to be able to know what it is that you can do and can't do, what the protocols are, and where you have to just push through because the protocols don't take women into account too often. It's way, way better now than my early days, when I'd usually be the only woman in the room that was in a UN meeting of some sort on that. So I think that having that kind of training is absolutely essential, and we shouldn't. And it's essential for men to get it, to know and recognize that, yeah, they are going to talk. I mean, there have been studies that show that men in these situations, when asked a question, will start talking even if they have absolutely no idea what the answer is, until they maybe come to the answer. Very few women will do that. If they don't think they know what they're doing, they don't raise their hand and start talking on that. And so I think I know that my own center at Georgetown that I founded, when the Biden administration said, yes, we will have people in the delegation and as speakers, the program, I'm not there anymore, but the program at Georgetown did do some training to help those who would be likely in that position to be able to understand, and they had people who have been there before and understand it from the government perspective, from the UN perspective, and from the NGO perspective, and where the lines are drawn and what you can do and how you do it. I think it's important for both sexes, but we're binary sexes. But there's very little. This is something that Rutgers could be doing to help people, help women who have not had experience in these kinds of frameworks, be able to go to a UN meeting in New York and feel comfortable there, and comfortable enough to pipe up when an issue comes up and not wait for someone else to talk about it.